wants us? Meanwhile, said the dwarf, what are we to do? I suppose I'd better go back to King Caspian and tell him that no help has come. No help, said Susan, but it has worked, and here we are. Yes, to be sure, I see that, said the dwarf, whose pipe seemed to be blocked. At any rate, he made himself very busy cleaning it. But, well, but don't you see who we are? Shouted Lucy. You are stupid. And I suppose you are the 4 children out of the old story, said Trumpkin. And I'm very glad to meet you, of course, and it's very interesting, no doubt, but no offense, as he hesitated again. Do get on and say whatever you're going to say, said Edmund. Well, then, no offense, said Trumpkin. But you know, the king and Truffle Hunter and Dr. Cornelius were expecting, well, if you see that, I mean, help. To put it another way, I think they'd be imagining you as great warriors. As it is, we're awfully fond of children and all that. But just at the moment, in the middle of the war, but I'm sure you understand. You mean you think we're no good, said Edmund, getting red in the face. Now pray don't be offended, interrupted the dwarf. I assure you, my dear little friends, little from you is really a bit too much, said Edmund, jumping up. I suppose you don't believe we won the Battle of Baruna. Well, you can say what you like about me, because I know... There's no good losing our temper, said Peter. Let's fit him out with the fresh armor, and fit ourselves out from the treasure chamber, and have a talk after that. I don't quite see the point, began Edmund, but Lucy whispered in his ear, Hadn't we better do what Peter says? He is the High King, you know, and I think he has an idea. So Edmund agreed, and by the aid of the torch, they all, including Trumpkin, went down the steps again into the dark coldness and dusty splendor of the treasure house. The dwarf's eyes glistened as he saw the wealth that lay on the shelves, though he had to stand on tiptoes to do so, and he muttered to himself, It would never do to let Nickabrick see this. Never. They found easily enough a mail shirt for him, a sword, a helmet, a shield, a bow, and a quiver full of arrows, all of dwarfish size. The helmet was of copper, set with rubies, and there was gold on the hilt of the sword. Trumpkin had never seen, much less carried, so much wealth in all his life. The children also put on mail shirts and helmets, a sword and shield were found for Edmund, and a bow for Lucy. Peter and Susan were, of course, already carrying their gifts as they came back up the stairwell, jingling in their mail, and already looking and feeling more like Narnians and less like schoolchildren. The 2 boys were behind, apparently making some plan. Lucy heard Edmund say, No, let me do it. It'll be more of a sucks for him if I win, and less of a letdown for us all if I fail. All right, Ed, said Peter. When they came out into the daylight, Edmund turned to the dwarf very politely and said, I've got something to ask you. Kids like us don't often have the chance of meeting a great warrior like you. Would you have a little fencing match with me? It would be frightfully decent. But, lad, said Trumpkin, these swords are sharp. I know, said Edmund, but I'll never get anywhere near you, and you'll be quite clever enough to disarm me without doing me any damage. It's a dangerous game, said Trumpkin, but since you make such a point of it, I'll try a pass or 2. Both swords were out in a moment, and the 3 others jumped off the dais and stood watching. It was well worth it. It was not like the silly fighting you see with broadswords on the stage. It was not even like the rapier fighting, which you sometimes see rather better done. This was real broadsword fighting. The great thing is to slash at your enemy's legs and feet, because they are the part that you have no armor. And then he slashes at yours, and when he slashes at yours, you jump with both feet off the ground so that his blow goes under them. This gave the dwarf an advantage because Edmund, being much taller, had to always be stooping. I don't think Edmund would have a chance if he fought Trumpkin 24 hours earlier, but the heir of Narnia had been working upon him ever since they arrived on the island, and all his old battles came back to him, and his arms and fingers remembered their old skill. He was King Edmund. Once more, round and round the 2 combatants circled, stroked after stroke they gave. Susan, who could never learn to do this sort of thing, shouted out, Oh, do be careful! And then, so quickly that no one, unless they knew, as Peter did, could see how it happened, Edmund flashed his sword round with a peculiar twist. The dwarf's sword flew out of his grip, and Trumpkin was wringing his empty hand as you do after a sting from a cricket bat. Not hurt, I hope, my dear little friend, said Edmund, panting a little, and returning his own sword to its sheath. I see the point, said Trumpkin dryly. You know a trick I never learned. That's quite true, put in Peter. The best swordsman in the world may be disarmed by a trick that's new to him. I think it's only fair to give Trumpkin a chance at something else. Will you have a shooting match with my sister? There are no tricks in archery, you know. Ah, you're jokers, you are, said the dwarf. I begin to see. As if I didn't know how she could shoot. After what happened this morning, all the same, I'll have a try. He spoke gruffly, but his eyes brightened, for he was a famous bowman among his people. All 5 of them came out into the courtyard. "What's to be the target?" asked Peter. "I think that apple hanging from over the wall of the branch should do there," said Susan. That'll do nicely, lass," said Trumpkin. "You mean the yellow one near the middle of the arch?" "No, not that," said Susan. "The red one up there, above, over the battlement." The dwarf's face fell. "Looks more like a cherry than an apple," he muttered, but he said nothing out loud. They tossed up for the first shot, greatly to the interest of Trumpkin, who had never seen a coin toss before, and Susan lost. They were to shoot from the top of the steps that led from the hall into the courtyard. Everyone could see from the way the dwarf took his position and handled his bow that he knew what he was about. Twang went the string. It was an excellent shot. The tiny apple shook as the arrow passed, and a leaf came fluttering down. Then Susan went to the top of the steps and strung her bow. She was not enjoying her match half so much as Edmund had enjoyed his. Not because she had any doubt about hitting the apple, but because Susan was so tender-hearted that she almost hated to beat someone who had been beaten already. The dwarf watched her keenly as she drew the shaft to her ear. A moment later, with a little soft thump, which they could all hear in a quiet place, the apple fell to the grass. Grass with Susan's arrow in it. "Oh, well done, Sue," shouted the other children. "It wasn't really any better than yours," said Susan to the dwarf. "I think there was a tiny breath of wind you shot." "No, there wasn't," said Trumpkin. "Don't tell me. I know when I'm fairly beaten. I won't even say that the scar of my last wound catches me a bit when I get my arm well back." "Oh, are you wounded?" asked Lucy. "Do let me look." "It's not a sight for little girls," began Trumpkin. But then he suddenly checked himself. "There I go, talking like a fool again," he said. "I suppose you're as likely to be a great surgeon as your brother was to be a great swordsman, or your sister to be a great archer." He sat down on the steps and took off his hauberk and slipped down his little shirt, showing an arm hairy and muscular in proportion. As a sailor's, though not much bigger than a child's, there was a clumsy bandage on the shoulder, which Lucy proceeded to unroll. Underneath, the cut looked very nasty, and there was a good deal of swelling. "Oh, poor Trumpkin," said Lucy. "How horrid." Then she carefully dripped onto it a single drop of the cordial from her flask. "Hello, eh? What have you done?" said Trumpkin. But, however, he turned his head and squinted and whisked his beard to and fro. He couldn't quite see it, his own shoulder. Then he felt it as well as he could, getting his arms and fingers into a very different position as you do when you're trying to scratch a place that is just out of reach. Then he swung his arm and raised it and tried the muscles, and finally jumped to his feet, crying, "Giants and junipers! It's cured! It's as good as new!" After that he burst into a great laugh and said, "Well, I'm made as big a fool as myself as ever a dwarf did. No offence, I hope. My humble duty to your majesty's all. Humble duty. And thanks for my life, my cure, my breakfast, and my lesson." The children all said it was quite all right, and not to mention it. "And now," said Peter, "if you really decided to believe in us—" "I have," said the dwarf. "It's quite clear what we must do. We must join King Caspian at once." "The sooner the better," said Trumpkin. "My being such a fool has already wasted about an hour." "It's about 2 days' journey the way you came," said Peter. "For us, I mean. We can't walk all day and night like you dwarves." Then he turned to the others. "What Trumpkin calls Aslan's How is obviously the stone table itself. You remember it was about a half-day's march, or a little less, from there down to the fords of Baruna." "Baruna's Bridge, we call it," said Trumpkin. "There was no bridge in our time," said Peter, "and then from Baruna down to here was another day and a bit. We used to get home about tea-time on the second day, going easily. Going hard, we could do the whole thing in a day and a half, perhaps." "But remember, it's all woods now," said Trumpkin, "and there are enemies to dodge." "Look here," said Edmund. "Need we go by the same way that our old little dear friend came?" "No more of that, your majesty, if you love me," said the dwarf. "Very well," said Edmund. "May I say our DLF?" "Oh, Edmund," said Susan, don't keep on at him like that." "That's all right, lass. I mean your majesty," said Trumpkin with a chuckle. A jibe won't raise a blister. And after that, they often called him the DLF, till they had almost forgotten what it meant. "As I was saying," continued Edmund, "we needn't go that way. Why shouldn't we row a little south till we come to Glasswater Creek, and row up it? That brings us behind the hill of the stone table, and we'll be safe when we're at sea. If we start at once, we can be at the head of Glasswater before dark, get a few hours' sleep, and be with Caspian pretty early tomorrow." "What a thing it is to know the coast," said Trumpkin. "None of us knows anything about Glasswater." "What about food?" asked Susan. "Oh, we'll have to do with some apples," said Lucy. "Do let's get on." We've done nothing yet, and we've already been out here nearly 2 days. And anyway, no one's going to have my hat for a fish basket again, said Edmund. They used one of the raincoats as a kind of bag and put a good many apples into it. Then they all had a good long drink at the well, for they would meet no more fresh water till they landed at the head of the creek, and went down to the boat. The children were so sorry to leave Cair-vette, which, even in ruins, had begun to feel like home again. The DLF had better steer, said Peter, and Ed and I will take an oar each. Half a moment, though. We'd better take off our mail. We're going to be pretty warm before we're done. The girls had better be in the bows and shout directions to the DLF because he doesn't know the way. You better get us a fair way out at sea until you pass the island. And soon the green wooden coast of the island was falling behind, and its little bays and headlands were beginning to look flatter, and the boat was rising and falling in a gentle swell. The sea began to grow bigger around them, and in the distance, bluer, but close round the boat, it was green and bubbly. Everything smelled salt, and there was no noise except for the swishing of the water and the clap of water against the sides, and the splash of oars and the jolting noise of the rowlocks. The sun grew hot. It was delightful for Lucy and Susan in the bows, bending over the edge and trying to get their hands in the sea when they could never quite reach. The bottom, mostly pure pale sand, but with occasional patches of purple seaweed, could be seen beneath them. It's like old times, said Lucy. Do you remember our voyage to Cair-vette and Gama and Seven Isles and the Lone Islands? Yes, said Susan, and our great ship, the Splendor Hyaline, with the swan's head at her prow and the carved swan's wings coming back almost to her waist, and the silken sails and the great stern lanterns, and the feast on the poop and the musicians. Do you remember when we had the musicians up in the rigging playing flutes so that it sounded like music out of the sky? Presently Susan took over Edmund's oar, and he came forward to join Lucy. They had passed the island now and stood closest to the shore, all wooden and deserted. They would have thought it were very pretty if it not remembered the time when it was open and breezy and full of merry friends. Whew, this is pretty grueling work, said Peter. Can I row for a bit, said Lucy. The oars are a bit too big for you, said Peter, shortly, not because he was cross, but because he had no strength to spare for talking. Oh, well, that was a sudden end. Cool, that's the end of chapter 8, and that'll be the end of the readings for tonight. Alright, I gotta read about a dream. Okay, so wake up in a cement world, and it's covered with fog and pillows. And this futuristic spaceman stands in front of me. As you read, I might fall asleep just because listening. Okay. No problem, man. If you fall asleep or if you sign off or whatever, I hope that you have a good night and pleasant dreams. And I'm sure I'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much for being here. I really do appreciate it. I know you're not huge on read streams, but it means a lot to have you here. And I hope that you enjoyed it for what it was. He can only hold the pointer finger and the middle finger on his right hand. He wears a ring with his thumb on the ring. That's what I usually do, fall asleep to Terror. Not because he's that boring, because he's like a kind grandma. Aww. Like a kind, handsome, male grandma. Aww. He says nothing and turns his helmet ring in the air. That's happening. Very handsome. Well, thank you. Thank you for the kindness, kind comments. So, well, I'm like between pillows. So I'll ask this fourth one onto the pillows. I've known him for 3 months now. The best 3 months of my life. Back in November. Huh. It's hard to believe. It's been a pleasure knowing you, Cass, and I'm sure it'll continue being a pleasure.